All right, thank you very much. Let me see if I can get my PowerPoint pulled up here. And hopefully everybody can see that okay. All right, and I'm gonna do this, I think. Well, I want to start by, again, just saying thanks to everybody for being here this evening. And also thank you to the CMA for the honor of allowing me to present the Elden Johnson Lecture this year. Although I never had the chance or the pleasure to meet Dr. Johnson, I have been aware of and influenced by his work for a very long time. So this is, in fact, as I said, an honor for me. I also want to begin, and let me see if I can switch my view here. Begin by acknowledging that Minnesota is Dakota land and full of Dakota places. And this is not to denigrate or ignore or silence other Native peoples who have made and called Minnesota their home, but to start with this basic and sort of undeniable fact that underpins the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight. And that is the civilian and military forts built during the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862. So today, both the so-called settlers' forts and military installations built in response to the Dakota War of 1862 are a largely unexplored part of Minnesota's archaeological heritage. So for this evening, I will begin with a brief commentary on the recent resurgence of fort and fortification site archaeology, just to kind of set the archaeological context. I will discuss how these sites are categorized and how the sites I will be discussing kind of fit into these definitions and categories. Next, I will examine how the memory and commemoration of the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862 and the fortifications built during this conflict have haunted and continued to haunt the state of Minnesota. And so I'll talk a little bit about kind of the theoretical perspective that I bring to bear on the topic tonight, and we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then finally, I'll turn to the actual material expression of two of the sites that we're going to talk about as revealed through archaeological investigations that we have been doing here at St. Cloud State. Okay, so a word about forts. The archaeology of forts has been, historical archaeology of forts has been around for a very long time, and early archaeological studies of forts were very often carried out in support of restoration and reconstruction projects aimed at commemorating and memorializing sites often of national significance. And so I think that the early work done at, the early archaeological work done at Fort Snelling in St. Paul is a really good example of this early archaeological study of fort sites here in North America. The goal very often was to very quickly clear and identify structural features, foundations, palisade and stockade lines with the aim of reconstructing those structures right there on site, and very often on the same footprint of the structures themselves. And the further aim was very often to bring about what we would call today heritage tourism, right? To bring people to these sites for public interpretation, to open them up to visitors, and to interpret the sites within that national framework, right? This idea that they were of some national significance. And again, I think that Fort Snelling, the early work at Fort Snelling ticks all of those boxes. The recent upswing, though, in the archaeology of forts, I believe provides an array of much needed new perspectives. So it's not that has gone away. I think that we still are very interested in finding the footprints of these sites, and sometimes very often still involved in the restoration work that goes along with that. But a lot of the more recent work has has, I think, brought new theories and new ideas and new perspectives to bear on the archaeology of fort sites and fortification sites. And I would include in this the recent work that we heard about this morning that's been going on out at Fort Snelling. I think that that's really important, work that's happening right here at a site locally, Fort locally. And I would just point out that the other thing that I think is happening, and probably not only here in Minnesota, but in other places as well, where the material culture recovered from some of these earlier excavations is now being looked at with fresh sets of perspectives as well. And just to point to two examples, tomorrow there is a talk in the conference on buttons recovered from Fort Snelling, and a talk on percussion caps recovered from Fort Snelling. So I see this as part of this new upswing in the archaeology of forts and fortification sites. And so I think that that's a very important part of it as well, going back to earlier collections and re-examining them from new and modern perspectives. So forts and fort sites are no longer assumed to be these monolithic military installations that were, quote, coherent, stable entities that played the same roles and attracted similar experiences regardless of their context. Forts and fortified sites are now recognized as having considerable variability in their degree of militarism and as having diverse reasons for why they were constructed and how they operated, in particular historical and social context. And these two statements come from Pesarozzi and Lightfoot, and I've found their work to be especially helpful in sort of summarizing some of this new attention that has been given to fort and fortification sites. Pesarozzi's work is in this volume that's illustrated here on the slide, British Forts and Their Communities, and Lightfoot's summary is part of a recent volume of historical archaeology, at least that was at least partially dedicated to the archaeology of fort and fortification sites. So drawing on their perspectives then, today we understand that the term fort refers to a category of site types that exist along a continuum. And so it's Pesarozzi and Lightfoot that I think together sort of construct this continuum from one end, possessive structures established to hold or claim contested spaces as part of imperial military projects, to anchoring the other end, fortified mercantile villages erected by colonial merchants to afford protection for their commercial enterprises. And everything sort of in between that you might be able to think about, with perhaps one exception. And so what is seemingly overlooked by historians and archaeologists alike, I think, are the multitude of fortifications constructed by civilians, most often as a direct response to the violence sparked by the very process of settler colonialism, the occupation of indigenous lands. And so you can sort of see this playing out across the North American continent. If we look early in New England, we see the construction of garrison houses, for example, during King Philip's War in the 1670s. About 100 years later, very similar civilian fortifications are these blockhouses and stations, which I'll show in just a moment, built during what's sometimes referred to as the Northwest Indian Wars between about 1785 and 1795 in places like Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, Indiana, in that part of the country. These types of forts and fortifications were the constant companion of settler colonialism. And this happens over and over again as the settlers get out in front of the military frontier. And so when it comes to, well, I want to show one more example, right? So we have those garrison houses and the blockhouses, and then there are these stations. This is Logan Station in Kentucky. Many of you might be more familiar with, for example, Boone Station, associated with Daniel Boone. But historian C.H. Sipe defined these stations as a parallelogram of cabins so united by palisades as to form a continued wall on the outer side. So they're really sort of fortified hamlets or very small fortified villages, if you will. And so these are, as I said, they're sort of the constant companion of settler colonialism all the way out to the West Coast. Mark Veskov has been working on some fort sites out in Oregon, including Fort Lane, but also identifying settlers' forts out there as well. So this phenomenon, I think, is really intriguing, and not one I think that has been given a lot of attention from a larger perspective. I think people in Kentucky know about the stations like Boone Station and Logan Station. Here in Minnesota, in 1862, we have a similar phenomenon. Immigrant settlers of Minnesota built an array of defensive forts known as settlers' forts, and we can define these as makeshift defensive structures that were in many cases constructed with few resources and little time. These expedient fortifications were in fact a hallmark of the earliest days of the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862. And I want to take a moment to very quickly emphasize a couple of things on this image. Number one, I want to thank Dave Mackey for providing this image for me to use tonight. This comes from a piece that Dave and Sigrid Arnott and Frankie Jackson are working on for a volume that both of us are part of. We were in a session together last year at the SAA meetings in Boston, and this is a shared figure between my chapter and that the session is now being published as an edited volume. And so we share this figure, and I really appreciate all of the work that Dave put into it. It's a remarkable figure with lots and lots of great information, but in particular, I want to point to, for this presentation, these little red triangles. And these are the forts that were built in 1862. And you can see that there were just quite a number of them. Kenneth Carley documented and mapped out about 50 of these forts in his research, but other researchers, such as David Vavrick, put that number closer to 70 or 80 of these settlers' forts. So these, along with the formal military stockades also constructed during and in the aftermath of the war, have been subject of a multi-year archaeological program conducted by myself and several graduate students in our CRM Archaeology MS program. So we're going to be taking a look at a few of these. We've done work at Fort Fairhaven, Fort Holes, as settlers' forts, and then looked at, a little bit later, we'll be looking at the work that we did at SAUK CENTR as well. And so just to point to the work of the graduate students involved, here we have 3 of the finished products. The work at the U.S. military post at SAUK CENTR we'll be talking about a little bit later. We'll start off by talking about the work that we did at Fort Fairhaven, one of these settlers' forts from 1862. And then Fort Holes, which was located right here on the campus of St. Cloud State. We did some work there as well. I'm not going to talk about that project as much tonight, but I will mention Fort Holes a few times in the historical importance of that site also. Okay. So before we get, though, to the archaeology, I want to give really just a brief history of the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862. A couple reasons. I assume that many people on the call tonight are familiar with this history, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on that. But there may be a few who aren't as familiar, so I want to just in very broad brush strokes talk about the history of the U.S. the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862, and then move on to some different ways, perhaps, of thinking about the war and its aftermath. So between 1805 and 1858, the Dakota entered into 12 treaties with the United States, which resulted in substantial losses of Dakota lands. By the 1860s, the ideological belief in manifest destiny had become material reality in many parts of Minnesota, especially in the Minnesota River Valley, where Dakota peoples were maneuvered onto a small strip of land along the banks of the river. Advertisements and editorials in newspapers in the United States and abroad touted visions of Minnesota as a paradise of agrarian capitalism and assured immigrants and settlers that there would not be the slightest danger to the people of Minnesota from Indians. But by the drought-stricken late summer of 1862, the tardiness of annuity payments and the refusal of government agents and traders to distribute much-needed food and supplies exacerbated an already smoldering tensions between Euro-American settlers and some factions of traditionalist Dakota. As one Dakota scholar has put it, by August of 1862, the Dakota were in a life and death struggle that required a reaction, and some chose war. When 4 young Dakota men killed 5 settlers, the Minnesota River Valley erupted into violence. Early reports were confused and contradictory, and as the disaster escalated, so did the hysteria. Stories of depredations and violence, both real and imagined, were reported daily in newspapers throughout Minnesota. For 6 weeks, groups of traditionalist Dakota men, ostensibly under the leadership of Little Crow and Big Eagle, attacked immigrant farmsteads, Euro-American settlements, and U.S. military installations throughout southwestern and central Minnesota. In August of 1862, the initial response to the violence by many Euro-American settlers was to flee the region, taking refuge in larger settlements such as St. Paul or St. Cloud. And I mentioned St. Cloud again because the place that many of these refugees fled to was Fort Holles. So even though Fort Holles never was really used in a military sense, it was used to house a lot of these refugees coming in from parts of this part of Minnesota, Stearns County, and looking for someplace to stay. And so a lot of them were put in this very large fort called Fort Holles. But in a social milieu now dominated by fear, uncertainty, and hatred, some settlers throughout Minnesota began fortifying their towns and villages as well. The variability of these settlers' forts is captured in a letter written in November 1862 by Samuel V. Carr. Now, Carr was a soldier in Company G of the 8th Minnesota Regiment, and he was part of a column marching from Fort Snelling to relieve Fort Abercrombie in September of 1862. Along the way, Carr took note of the settlers' forts he encountered as they passed through some of these Minnesota villages and towns. And his letter is really remarkable for capturing just a sense of what kinds of responses local settlers were putting forth as a result of the conflict taking place. So when he gets to Elk River, he notes that at Elk River they have a, quote, very heavy, good stockade. Marches along a little further to Monticello, where he sees a church, quote, protected by a very formidable stockade. And then a little farther up, he comes to St. Cloud. At St. Cloud, he notes a very good and substantial fort. This is Fort Holles. It really was a pretty substantial structure. And it was one of the targets of our archaeological investigations. Further up in Richmond, He sees earthworks around a church, quote, thrown up as a defense. It doesn't sound like those are quite as elaborate as some of the stockades and other defensive works that he's seen so far. Then he gets to SAUK Center. At SAUK Center, the local settlers fort looked to him more like a pen or child's playhouse, is the way that he characterized it. Later, when the U.S. military comes back to establish the U.S. military post at SAUK Center, they will say very similar things in official correspondence, that the local settlers fort is far too small and unsanitary. But for now, Carr's letter is really remarkable in showing some of the variability, some of the different approaches that these different communities were taking in response to the conflict. Thinking about this, right? So this image on the slide here is the stockade at Forest City. Everything from something like this stockade at Forest City to the massive structure at Fort Holes to this child's playpen at SAUK Center, and probably everything in between is what we can expect in terms of the variability of these sites. But as I noted, there are probably somewhere around 80 of them out there, and very few, other than the ones that we've looked at, I think have been recorded archaeologically. So I just bring this up in terms of archaeological interest and archaeological projects, to be thinking about whether or not these sites are there and are leaving behind an archaeological footprint. For example, I think that Forest City is a good candidate for one of these sites. It's been reconstructed today. If you ever get a chance, it's worth driving out there to take a look at it. They hold a couple of events during the year, at least in normal times, pre-COVID times. One in the summer or spring, I think, and one around Christmas. And I've had an opportunity to talk to some of the organizers of these events, and they're pretty certain that the stockade that's reconstructed and is there today is not on top of the footprint of the original stockade from 1862, which means probably that it's in one of the agricultural fields around the reconstructed stockade. So there, I think there's an opportunity for some archaeology to be done. Here in Stearns County, Main Prairie is another settlement that had a settlers fort that also, I think, has a lot of potential for having an archaeological having archaeological deposits related to some of these forts. And there are probably dozens and dozens of others. I think it's just a type of site that's not been much on the radar of archaeologists. And so I'm hoping to get that out there a little bit and have people be aware of and looking for these sites. Now, so the flip side of that coin then is the U.S. military response to the conflict. So in response, the U.S. Military Department of the Northwest sent 4 regiments to central and western Minnesota. 2 of the regiments constructed and garrisoned a line of forts from the Iowa and Minnesota border north to Fort Ridgely, to Painesville, SAUK Center, Alexandria, Pomme de Terre, and the line ends at Fort Abercrombie on the Minnesota-Dakota Territory border. So here again, here's St. Cloud, SAUK Center, Alexandria, Pomme de Terre. These sites also, I think, are Painesville, for example, are sites where archaeologists might take interest in some of these forts that were built during and in the aftermath of the conflict. I've been contacted, for example, by some folks in Painesville who think that they know exactly where the fort was located there. They found some artifacts, for example, some metal detectors have found some artifacts that they think might be related to the stockade at Painesville. So again, I think this is a type of site in Minnesota that hasn't garnered a lot of attention, though I think our work shows that the potential is there for good archaeology to be done. Back to the history, we kind of all know, right, that in the end, the militant Dakota were defeated at the Battle of Wood Lake, and Dakota people as a whole were forced to pay the price. Around 400 Dakota men were arrested, and 303 were quickly sentenced to death, and only the intervention of President Abraham Lincoln saved the vast majority of the condemned. Still, 38 Dakota men were hanged on the morning of December 26, 1862, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. Nearly 2,000 surrendered Dakota women, children, and elders were force-marched to a concentration camp at Fort Snelling, and over the winter of 1862, more than 200 Dakota died in that camp. Today, memorials to the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862 are widespread over Minnesota. Even so, as late as 2004, at least one researcher could write that for most Euro-Minnesotans, the Dakota War of 1862 is forgotten history. And this leads to the spectral quality of the conflict and its aftermath as something that is constantly both present, that is materially inscribed into the cultural landscape in the form of monuments and memorials, and yet at the same time hauntingly absent in the everyday lives of most white Minnesotans. What emerges from this spectrality, as we're going to call it, is a contemporary landscape of fear and loathing. As cultural geographers Carlson and John note, quote, "This is what memorials do: aggrandize specific events and permanently etch them into place, in this case overshadowing thousands of years of Native history and ignoring the continued presence of Dakota people," unquote. The recent scholarly interest in spectrality derives from the work of French deconstructuralist Jacques Derrida, who drew upon the specter of Marx to decry the triumphalism of liberal democracies and the purveyors of capitalism following the collapse of the Soviet Union. For Derrida, the spectral was both visible and invisible, both watching and watched, and the spectral is also a revenant. And this will become important as we start to talk about the archaeological record, because I see very clearly some tie-ins with what we do as archaeologists. So the revenant is always returning to haunt the present, and hence Derrida's focus on what he called hauntology. Now, hauntology is a play on words between haunted and ontology, and it's a deconstructivist methodology for reshaping how history is understood by, quote, disrupting its conventional structure of chronology, unquote. So hauntology is, as it says here on the slide, is represented by the figure of the ghost as that which is neither present nor absent, neither dead nor alive. Okay, so what does all that mean? I was drawn to this perspective a couple of years ago when I sat on the committee for a graduate student in our Department of Geography here at St. Cloud State. It seems that cultural geographers have been using this concept of spectrality and hauntology for quite some time, and there's even sort of a noted spectral turn in the social sciences related to this work stemming from Deirdre's volume. I had never heard much about it, but as I read the research that the student was doing and started to get into the literature a little bit myself, I thought that that this was something that archaeologists should know about. So I went looking to see if there was much archaeological literature written from this perspective, the perspective of spectrality and hauntology, and pretty much nothing. There's not a whole lot out there at all. The only examples that I did see came from the Journal of Contemporary Archaeology, looking at sites related to, for example, World War II in Europe. Cultural anthropologists have had a little more interaction or engagement with this concept, and I did see a couple of ethnographic studies that utilized the ideas of hauntology and spectrality. But as I sat on this committee, I began to think more and more that this was something that might apply to the archaeological work that we were currently doing at the time, as this thesis was being put together. So I want to give some examples from the work that was done on in this thesis, and then hopefully show how I think it can apply to the kind of archaeology that we've been doing here recently. So the Candy-Ojai County Historical Society marker that you see here to memorialize the killing of Berger Thorson by the Dakota in 1862 is, I think, a good example of how this perspective can be used. The Thorson marker notes that he was the first, sort of bold and underline that for a moment, the first resident of what is now the city of Wilmer, and that his cabin stood on what is now North 7th Street and Olaf Avenue in Wilmer. From a hauntological perspective, the temporal and spatial juxtaposition of Euro-American beginnings, the first resident, and this entails an imagined Dakota disappearance. So you can't be the first somewhere if people are already there, right? He can't be the first settler if there are already people living there. So this wordplay, right, involves disappearing the Dakota completely from the picture so that Berger Thorson can be the first. It's this kind of idea, right, of playing with space and time in these monuments that Molly Lou Pintock, she's the student who was doing this work, saw as an example of what she called spectrality through the narrative of the two cultures' relationship to time and space. The text on this and many other markers is an example of what we might refer to as spectral discourse, which conflates the past and the present and evokes a sense that time is out of joint. And that comes from Deirdre, and he's drawing on Shakespeare there, right, from Hamlet, to say that something weird is going on at these places where we see these monuments. How can somebody be the first when there have been people there for thousands of years, for example? And so this conflation of time and space and the disappearing and silencing of people to make that possible, this is what we mean by a spectral discourse. And so these places where time is out of joint are places where multiple and disparate stakeholders experience very different social memories and claim very different understandings of the same physical setting. And so for me as an archaeologist, that resonated, right? It resonated with what we do and how we are involved in sort of this bringing the past into the present and thinking about it then the process of how we do that in terms of spectrality and hauntology. So we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, one class then of Dakota War sites that have been memorialized in this way, including what we just saw there with the monument in Candy-Ojai County, are the civilian and military fortifications built during and following the conflict. In the 1930s, veteran of the conflict, John Howard, noted that, quote, few of the towns where stockades were located have placed suitable markers on the sites, unquote. Howard's statement was written as part of an article he wrote for the Minnesota History magazine, and his concerns were taken to heart. And today, communities across Minnesota have erected monuments to commemorate these fortification sites. As might be expected, though, many of them expressed that dominant narrative of settler colonialism that we saw on the Thorson monument as well, right? And so that's part of the issue here. The places that we have worked, all of the places that we have done our work, have a marker that goes along with the site, right? So there's a marker for Fort Holes, there's the marker at Fort Fairhaven, and a marker at the U.S. military post at SAUK Center. And so we are already engaging with that narrative just by being there on those sites. Now, and here are the two that we're dealing with here tonight, the markers from the two sites. When I arrived in Minnesota in 2013, I knew next to nothing about the Dakota War of 1862. And while on a family outing to an apple orchard in the tiny village of Fairhaven, I was surprised to see this historical marker commemorating Fort Fairhaven. A couple of things. If you're ever in Stearns County in the fall, you should visit Fairhaven Farm. It's a great apple orchard with a lot of things to do. You pick apples. They have pumpkin patch and lots of baked goods and lots of really cool and fun stuff to do. And so I would say that number one. Secondly, many of you who have been doing archaeology for a while can probably imagine the sighs and groans and eye rolls from the passenger seat and the back seat as I swerved the car off the road to pull over and look at this marker. But I was just amazed that there was a fort in this part of Minnesota that I had never heard anything about. So I had to get out and read the marker and try to figure out what was going on there. And when I went back then and started looking into this a little bit more, I began to wonder about these forts, or about this fort in particular, at least at first, wondering how substantial these hastily built non-military structures actually were. I mean, so it's called a fort, and when you go to the property where it actually stood, there's a homemade sign that calls it a fortress. And so, you know, in my mind, that conjures up all kinds of images that didn't sort of square with this idea that it was built very quickly by civilians, probably not trained in military engineering. And so what would that look like archaeologically? That's what sort of spurred this whole project. Not only that, I was also somewhat surprised to find that at least as of 2014, not a single 1862 settlers fort had been recorded archaeologically. And likewise, very few of the military fortifications built in response to the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862 have been recorded. So there I saw an opportunity to go out and do some work to see exactly what these sites look like in terms of their archaeology. So I want to begin with our work at Fort Fairhaven. Fort Fairhaven is located in the southeast corner of Stearns County. It was constructed in late August of 1862 around a log hotel built in 1857. The women and children of the village were sent to larger settlements, while 15 men remained in Fairhaven, harvesting crops by day and sleeping in the fort at night. This is an 1896 map of Fairhaven that shows the location of a hotel on lot 12 of section 45, and this lot was the focus of our excavations in the summers of 2015 and 2016. In 2015, we conducted a gradiometer survey over the project area. The gradiometer detected a number of magnetic anomalies, several of which we targeted for shovel testing. Our shovel test pits revealed the presence of a deeply buried soil horizon, which contained artifacts diagnostic of the 19th century. Below these deposits in two STPs, two shovel test pits, we defined two post molds that we interpreted at the time to be the remains of a possible stockade line associated with the Fort Fairhaven. So with that in mind, and I have to say, I think we got really lucky to find the post molds in these STPs. But with that in mind, we returned to the site in 2016 as part of the SCSU Summer Archaeological Field School, and we excavated 14.5 1 meter by 1 meter test units. We defined and mapped 26 possible post features, and at least 3 of these post features exhibited both the post hole and the post mold stains. One post feature contained a small intact portion of the wooden post we believe was set in this location in the late summer of 1862. These post features, as you can see on the map here, form a definitive, though irregular, line of post running north and south. We interpret these features as being the physical remains of, quote unquote, Fort Fairhaven. The zigzagged pattern, the assorted size, spacing, and depths of the post suggest that this was not a fortification that would have met general military standards of the time. It is more likely that these posts formed part of a defensive structure, such as a barricade, which might have included things like and incorporated things like cordwood, planks, barrels, crates, and even wagons to form a more or less solid wall. And we have historical documentation from other places that was sometimes the case. We have documentation of people pulling timbers off of buildings, robbing parts of one building to create fortifications elsewhere. And so this is what it seems like was going on here at Fairhaven. Further, we found 2 posts in our excavations that were set back equidistant from the main line of posts, and they were set into the ground at an angle, suggesting that they were placed there to brace components of the barricade system. And those are posts 25 and 22 that you see here. And when we bisected those posts, you could see that the post actually went in at an angle. And so that's what we think that they were doing. They were there to brace something else that was in front of them. Okay, so unlike Fort Fairhaven, to switch gears, the U.S. military post at SAUK Center was actually part of the U.S. military's response to the conflict. The SAUK Center post served as the regional headquarters for military operations designed to protect local settlers and to keep open the Red River Oxcart Trail, a crucial route for commerce. And just as an aside, speaking of other papers being given in this conference, I want to point out David Mather's really interesting talk that I think is tomorrow morning on bone hair pipe beads possibly associated with the Red River Oxcart Trail. I'm really looking forward to that one as well. So protecting this commerce was one of the reasons, protecting this trail was one of the reasons that the Lincoln administration responded to the crisis in Minnesota with 4 regiments of infantry at a time when the Union Army was not faring so well in putting down the Confederate insurrection in the South. So in the summer of 2018, we conducted archaeological investigations at the SAUK Center post. Using historical sources, we identified 2 properties with the potential to contain archaeological deposits and further narrowed our research area by overlaying a scaled drawing of the U.S. military post at SAUK Center on a U.S. Google Earth map. And I just want to point out very quickly what's going on here with this map. This is not a GIS. It wasn't created in a GIS program. My friend and colleague, archaeologist with the Wisconsin Historical Society, had been playing around with this for a number of years, and he put together a user's guide on how to do this. It's, you know, basically what we used to call rubber sheeting, where you would take one image and put it on a transparency and use a photocopier to overlay that image onto another image. So it's basically doing that digitally on Google Earth. We were very fortunate to have this scaled drawing of the fort. I'll show it to you in a different slide in a few minutes as well. But for now, because it was scaled and because we had some markers that we could geo-reference and we knew where north was on the map, we were able to place it on the modern landscape and then look at what might be present in the areas where we had permission to work. And so you can see here, we call this area the barn area, and we'll talk about that in just a moment because it's related to what on this map is referred to as the barn and stables of Pendergast. And then over here, you can see the officers' quarters This is the southwest corner of the officers' quarters, and so we targeted this area for our investigations as well. You can also see very clearly that the fort lies right smack in the middle of a residential area. It's in a subdivision, and so we were kind of limited in what kinds of methodologies we could use. Of course, there are lots of utility lines, water lines, gas lines, and all of those kinds of things to have to deal with. So we opted to go with metal detectors because we felt that they would allow us to quickly and efficiently survey the project area with pretty minimal disturbance to the site and residential lawns. We used a combination of very low frequency metal detectors and pulse induction metal detectors in order to maximize our ability to identify both near surface and more deeply buried metallic artifacts, artifact clusters, and possible features associated with the SAUK Center post. Systematic metal detector survey transects in the barn area, and the officers' quarters area were particularly productive, and so that's what I want to talk a little bit about here this evening. Okay, so these three images, I want to mention them very quickly. The image here is an image of the fort from 1862, and I've highlighted in all three images the same structure. And remember, this is the image that we use to overlay on the Google Earth image, and it refers to this barn and stables of Pendergast. Here it says stables. This would be the store or the home of Pendergast, Solomon Pendergast. Right there is that same structure on this 1863 map. But this is my favorite map of the site. This map is a memory map drawn by a lady named Della Veeder. When Della was a child of, I think, about 8 or 9 years old in 1863, her family traveled through SAUK Center and they spent some time at the fort. Sometime much later in her life, she returned to SAUK Center, and somebody there had the presence of mind to ask her to draw a map of how she remembered the fort looking. And so this is her memory looking back at her childhood and trying to reconstruct what she remembered about the fort. It's incredibly accurate. Her memory was incredible. I'll get to this highlighted structure in a moment. But this is the gate of the fort. Not only did she draw the gate and got it exactly right, she also drew the road that they probably came in on and left. And it's the same road that you see on this 1862 drawing. So a contemporaneous drawing of the fort shows that road in just about the same configuration that she drew it from memory much later in her life. She got the location of all of the structures correct. Here's Mr. Pendergast's store. Here we see it in this 1863 map of the site of the post, and in this 1862 drawing of the post. She got the location of the officers' quarters correct and the quarters for civilians, which we see here on this map and also on the map from 1862. So her detail was amazing. One thing that's kind of disconcerting about all three of these maps is nobody seems to know how many bastions were on the fort. So Della remembered a bastion on all four corners. In 1863, we have a bastion planned for only one of the corners, though there may have been one down here. The map is damaged there, it's hard to see. And on the map from 1862, I'm not sure what you guys can see in terms of where the images are. 1862 map, the only bastion is down here at the opposite corner. So that's the one piece of it that doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but obviously that would be something that we could try to get a handle on archaeologically. But more to the point for our current discussion is these yellow highlighted structures in all three maps. So it's called a stables in 1862. It's called a barn and stables of Pendergast in 1863. But that's not what Della Veeder remembered. When she labeled this building, looking back at what she remembered about that place in 1863 as a child, it was not a barn. And so she wrote COM period. It was, in fact, the post commissary. And that makes the archaeological evidence found in that part of the site much more explainable. So when we did our metal detector survey in this part of the fort, we found an array of tin cans, including this crushed hole and cap can. Hole and cap cans were introduced in about 1820 or so and allowed filled containers to be closed and then heated to drive off excess moisture. And then the matchstick filler hole in the center of the cap was sealed with a drop of solder. The post commissary that Della Veter pointed out, and that other documents, military documents, also tell us that the military commandeered the barn to be the commissary. But I really like Della Veter's map the best. The post commissary was almost certainly stocked with foodstuffs packaged in hole and cap tin cans, which were being produced by the millions during the Civil War. Now, what we could discern of the dimensions of this crushed hole and cap can that we recovered is that it might be a number 3 can, which likely contained tomatoes or other kinds of fruit. So we felt pretty confident once we started to look at the artifacts that we were finding in this part of the site and relating it to the structure that we knew was there. And in 1862 and 1863, all the way up through 1865 at least, this structure was the post commissary. And so it made sense that we were finding all of these tin cans in that location. When we turned our attention to the officers' quarters, we recovered another array of artifacts that help us to interpret that part of the site as well. We recovered a stamped copper and brass clasp identified by Dr. Ryan McNutt, who's the director of the Camp Lawson Archaeological Project, as a possible officer's sash buckle. And so here you see the artifact that we found, and this is an example of a sash buckle or clasp from Camp Lawton in Georgia. Camp Lawton was a 1864 Confederate POW camp located in southern Georgia. Now, according to Dr. McNutt, sash buckles do not seem to be a military issue, but they do seem to be an incredibly common and accepted personal addition, especially during the American Civil War. And it's significant that it was recovered from the officers' quarters, since only officers were permitted to use sashes as a symbol of their rank and status. Also notable is this suspender clip that we have here. And there was a similar suspender clip found at Camp Lawton as well. I'm going to speed through here because I do want to have some time for questions, and it looks like we're already starting to run out of time. So we also found in the officers' quarters this cupreous artifact that is a wind cap for a pipe. A briar pipe in particular is the kind of pipe that we think that it belonged to. And we did some test excavations, some shovel test pits, and a few open excavation units where we recovered things like ironstone ceramic, including this piece with a British registry mark that dates it to between 1842 and 1867. Okay, to bring this all back full circle, for many Dakota descendants, the War of 1862 has left an intergenerational legacy of terror. Such intergenerational trauma can be conceptualized as a haunting force. And there can be no doubt that the specter of the War of 1862 still haunts the state of Minnesota, as we can see with this event that was supposed to take place in 2017 at the Walker Art Center. The exhibit of LA artist Sam Durant's sculpture, Scaffold, which was a representation of the gallows used by the U.S. government to execute 38 Dakota men in Mankato. The Dakota were not consulted about this exhibit, and they were distraught when they recognized what was being built there. One Dakota woman told a reporter that it should be publicly taken down so that we can see it come down. It's really traumatizing for our people to look at. Further protests and consultations ultimately led to the dismantling and burying of the exhibit by Dakota elders. So likewise, so given the materiality of this event, right, this continued spectral haunting of the current landscape by the events of 1862, the revenant qualities of archaeological materials are also undeniable, since making the invisible visible again is what we do best as archaeologists. So applying Derrida's ontological approach to the archaeology of the Dakota-U.S. War of 1862 provides an opportunity to use the metaphor of the ghost as a way to pursue that which haunts like a ghost, and as such demands justice, or at least a response. And I think that's the least that we can do, right, is give a response. So these hastily driven wooden posts, crushed cans of tinned food items, and the personal effects of military officers are not the detritus of romanticized heroic frontiersmen. They are the bits and pieces of the lives of Euro-American settlers and soldiers, some of which may have seemed quite incidental to them, but were anything but incidental to the Dakota and other native peoples of Minnesota. And hence, they retain the capacity to haunt the present. They are revenant. They are the specters of fear and loathing. They are the specters of men and women caught up in historical processes that they bear some responsibility for, even if these processes were at the same time too large and too complex for them to fully understand. It is this materiality of these specters of the past that we as archaeologists must grapple with if we hope to be part of the effort to give voice to those experiencing ongoing intergenerational traumas brought on by settler colonialism, and to be resolved that we will not let those traumas continue to poison our collective future. And I just want to make sure that I get my acknowledgments in. All of our work at all three of these sites, Fort Fairhaven, Fort Holes, and the U.S. military post at SAUK Center, have been funded in part by the state of Minnesota from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund through the Minnesota Historical Society. I also want to make sure that I acknowledge my graduate students who have done work on these sites, Jake Dupree at Fort Fairhaven, Charlie Poliska at Fort Holes, and Mike Penrod at the U.S. military post at SAUK Center. And it looks like I'm right at my time limit, so I do want to stop right there in case there's a little bit of time for questions.